Hello again, and welcome to the St. Louis Blues Hockey Legends Podcast. Tom Calhoun here to shine a light on the stories of those instrumental in blues history. The Blues Legends Podcast is presented by Sarah Honda, O'Fallon, Illinois. Check out their 618 Sarah Bucks offer at sarahhondaofallon.com. A participating sponsor, the Gateway Grizzlies. Big Time Rodeo is coming to Arsenal BG Ballpark October 3rd and 4th. Visit gatewaygrizzlies.com for tickets and details. On this episode, it's a visit with a man whose hockey life has taken many great and admirable turns. A Minnesota high school state champion and University of Minnesota two-time NCAA champion, a blues player and coach, a highly respected hockey analyst for Blues, Minnesota, New York Islanders, and the Rangers, and national broadcasts as well, and a dear friend of mine for many years. Part one of our visit with the great Joe Micheletti, coming your way in 60 seconds.
When it's time to find your next car, what's changed in your life? What's driving you to start the process? What are you really looking for? These are the questions we're asking at Sarah Honda. We believe in real communication, real problem solving, and trustworthy long-term relationships with our customers. We're part of your community, and we want you to be part of ours. At Sarah Honda, the experience drives everything. You've got a lot going on in life, and you depend on your car to get you to places you need to be. So when it's time for maintenance or repair, we know you need it done fast and done right. Convenience and quality customer service with team members you can trust. That's what you're looking for. We'll get you safely back on the road and back to your busy life. At Sarah Honda, the experience drives everything.
And on this episode of the Blues Legends Hockey Podcast, we're thrilled to have an old friend, Joe Micheletti, on board for this episode. And Joe, it's great to see you, and thanks for coming on.
Tom, it's so great to see you. I mean, I was thinking about this today as I was getting ready for this, and I thought, boy, you and I have known each other for a long time. Probably 45 years or so. Yeah. Since I first got to St. Louis in late 70s, and you and I have had a long-term friendship, and it's been appreciated.
And doubly so on this end. Yes, it's been great, and we'll get back to those early days in broadcasting here in a little bit. But what I'd like to do on this podcast, and what fans of this thing have told me they like, is learning a little bit more about the person. There's a public person, and then there's also the real person. And let's learn more a little bit about Joe Micheletti and his life starting back in Hibbing, Minnesota. Hibbing's practically in Canada, right?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I grew up in Hibbing, but our family did not move to Hibbing until I was 4 years old. I was actually born in International Falls, Minnesota, which is right up on the Canadian border. I mean, there was a river that ran through International Falls, and right across the river was Fort Frances, Ontario. So I was the fifth of 9 kids. The first 7 were born in International Falls. So we migrated south 100 miles from International Falls to Hibbing when I was 4 years old. So, but Hibbing was the place that I grew up, and I certainly have most of my memories from.
And Hibbing's a pretty good hockey player development place. There's several guys that have come out of Hibbing and made the NHL.
Yeah, I was so fortunate to grow up there. And it was only a town of 15, 16, 17,000 people. But we loved hockey. We loved all the sports, actually. And we were able to develop as 4 and 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds. It's so much different now. There's so much more emphasis on traveling and playing only one sport, and which I think is a mistake. But it was a place where it developed both people and athletes, and it wasn't just hockey. I mean, Kevin McHale, who had a Hall of Fame career with the Boston Celtics, is a good friend of our family. In fact, we grew up. Kevin was 2 years younger than me, but my brother Don, who graduated with Kevin from high school, they played hockey together, and Kevin played hockey right up until probably 7th or 8th grade for him, and then he had this huge growth spurt, and he focused more on basketball. But to this day, Kevin loves hockey and travels to Duluth. He lives in Scottsdale in the off season, Scottsdale, Arizona, but travels to Duluth to watch the University of Minnesota Duluth play the Bulldogs, because Jim Sandelin, who's the head coach and has been there for all these years, also was a graduate of Hibbing High School with Kevin and my brother. And so Kevin's had a long-term love for hockey, and that's the way Hibbing was. I mean, so hockey, of course, because so much of the weather was winter type weather, and so we had a great opportunity to skate outdoors. We had a rink in our backyard and another larger rink a couple of blocks down from where we lived. But we all played. We played all the sports. We played football. We played hockey. We played baseball. I had friends that were in basketball, like Kevin, and track and field, and you name it. There were just a tremendous amount of athletes that came out of there.
Yeah. So you mentioned one of 9 children of your mother and father. Tell us about mom and dad and those brothers and sisters that you had, and how life was, as a kid.
Well, it's. Remember when I took my kids, who were probably 7 and 9, not the first time up to Hibbing when we were living in St. Louis, but it was when I thought that they were old enough to actually see the house that we grew up in, because I wanted them to appreciate what and how they lived and understand how I grew up. And so we lived on this little corner lot up on 3rd Avenue in Hibbing, in this little brick house. And so I was driving, I took my kids, and of course my wife Kathy was with us, and I said, "Here's the house." And they went, "What? 9 kids?" And I said, yeah, and I drove real slow, and then I turned the corner so they could see the side of the house and the garage. And I said, "That's where my father would build our rink for us outside every year." And as we're driving past real slowly, there was a lady in the yard, and she yells to me, "You must be a Micheletti." And I said, "I am." She says, "Well, come on in." And I said, "Nah, that's okay. I don't want to bother you." She says, "All your other brothers and sisters have been through." She says, "Pull over and come on in." So I was able to see our old house, take my kids through that house, and they could not believe how 11 people could live in this little house. and there were 2 bedrooms. It was a 1 story with a basement, 2 bedrooms upstairs, one for my mother and father, the other one for my 2 sisters. There were 7 boys and 2 girls. And then in the basement, there was the rest of us, and 4 in 1 room. And there was 1 little bedroom that the oldest in the house that was still in high school got that one. And the rest of us just, and it was the greatest life and upbringing that you could imagine, because that was us. My parents loved us. They treated us special. They taught us how to work and how to appreciate other people. And they really, told us that there's only one way to be, and that's try to be nice to people. My mother used to say this all the time: be nice to people, because it doesn't cost anything to be nice to people. And so that's kind of the way we've tried to live throughout. So I was so lucky with my upbringing.
Yeah. If only more people were brought up that way, that would be a great thing. And I will say this at this point, because you're speaking to it. Your mom and dad did a great job, because folks, Joe Micheletti is just one of the nicest people I've ever encountered in all my years in doing what I do. And he always asks about, how's your family doing? How's everything going at home? Blah, blah, blah. And that's, like you say, it doesn't cost anything to show some interest in another person.
Well, that's nice of you to say, Tom. And there's a reason why we've enjoyed each other's company for 45 years. And even though these last I went away for 27 to New York.
Yeah.
Those relationships, I still have a lot of great relationships in St. Louis, despite, distances and that type of thing. And everybody goes through that they get married, they have kids, families. A lot of people go through difficult times and difficult issues, but, it's really the most important thing in life is your relationship with your family and your friends. So I've always tried to keep that in mind and live that way.
And you obviously have. Good job. So talk about your current family situation a little bit. I know you're moving around, thinking about moving back to St. Louis. Tell us about your kids, grandkids, and all that.
Well, so we had, first of all, my wife and I just, recently celebrated our 44th wedding anniversary, and she's a St. Louis girl. Yeah, you talk about being lucky. I've had so many good people in my life that have helped me, and thank God for her. And she grew up in Florissant, and we met when I was playing in St. Louis, and she wasn't a hockey fan. She didn't know anything about it. So, and so we've been blessed. We were blessed with two great kids. And Adam, our son, lives in St. Louis, and he and his wife Rachel have an 8-year-old daughter, Mary. So we have one grandchild there, and then our daughter Allison, who was our second child. She lives in a suburb of Minneapolis now with her husband Mike, and they have 5 kids. Wow. And so Kathy and I have spoken a lot, especially the last 3-4 years, about getting back to the Midwest and spending more time and seeing our kids and grandkids. We've got 6 grandkids. They're all growing up fast, and we don't see our kids or them enough. So we wanted to get back there, so that's part of this.
And that was kind of the reason, or at least one of the reasons behind your retirement, right? I read where you felt like you might retire a year earlier than you did because of that, and you had some illness in your family, I know too, that kind of contributed to it, and you wanted to be closer to the family for that. So, but you stuck on another year to be with Sam on his final ride, right?
Yeah, that was. I really wasn't sure. I had, since I had 3 brothers that all got terminal cancer within a year and a half of each other, and that was about 3.5 years ago or so when that started, and it made me, even though I was under contract, it made me really think about my job, my life, my kids, my family, my wife, time spent together, and all those things, and so I started taking, each year, a year at a time, get through it, assess what the year was like, assess the family situation, and then make a decision to move on. And so this past season, I really wasn't sure at all. I mean, I was just about into June thinking about whether I was going to do another year or not. And then Sam surprised me with the announcement that he was going to retire. And so I said to my wife, I said, listen, with this, I'm going to do one more year. I'm 99.9% chance that this sure that this was going to be my final season. And I said, let's keep it to me and you. And our kids still didn't believe us until we finally did it, but we told them. And then, and then the season, and then one of my bosses wanted to keep extending my contract because my contract was up. And I told him that I was going to wait until the end of the year, reassess. I told him I had been doing that for the last number of years. And so that's what I did. The season ended. We had a heck of a final farewell for Sam, and it was so deserving for what his career has been about. And so we celebrated that, even though the hockey team wasn't very good and they had a bad year, but we did that for Sam. And then I waited a week. I had lunch with my boss and told him that was enough. So that's kind of how all that went down.
Saddle up, folks. The TK Pro Rodeo is coming to Arsenal BG Ballpark, home of the Gateway Grizzlies, this October 3rd and 4th. We kick things off on October 3rd with the World Bull Tour Championship, where 30 of the top bull riders will compete for the ultimate prize. And then October 4th, we'll have a full-scale rodeo featuring world-class athletes from the U.S., Canada, Australia, and Brazil. They'll go head-to-head in all 8 official rodeo events, including steer wrestling, barrel racing, and bull riding. There's fun for the entire family, from face painting, inflatables, balloon animals, and more. Head over to gatewaygrizzlies.com to grab your tickets today. You don't want to miss this.
So, moving on to hockey a little bit, Joe Micheletti, we understand that you played college hockey at the University of Minnesota, but before we get there, do you remember what turned you on to the sport of hockey, or was it just part of living where you lived?
I think it was a combination of things. So I had the first 6 kids in our family were boys. I was the 5th of those 6, and so I had older siblings that were all athletes, and so I remember being when I was 4 years old, we just moved to Hibbing. My father built this ice rink in the back with the help of really my oldest brother Tom, who was one of the brothers that I talked about that had terminal cancer, and we lost him about a year ago. But he was the leader of our family, and he was the one that pushed us. He read this. He talked about when he was very young, reading a book about leadership, and he talked about that a lot. He was a fearless leader, and so he was the one that got us to do things, So he was the one that said, "Hey, it's your turn. Here's the skates. Help, would put them on, drag me out there," and he did that with all of us. So. We only had one of the 7 brothers that didn't play hockey, and he should have, because he was the toughest of everybody. That was Jim, who, again, one of the brothers that I lost recently, and he played college football. He was a 175-pound defensive back at the University of North Dakota, but he just didn't like the cold. He hated the cold, so he didn't want to go outside on the ice. But he was so tough. And he should have played. He probably would have been the best hockey player out of all of us. And so he was the second oldest, but it was my brother Tom that kept pushing us. And then in the spring it was baseball, and then and through the summer, and then towards the end of the summer it was football. It was throwing a football, and it was because back in those days you didn't play these sports 12 months out of the year. Yeah. And so, I remember when I graduated from high school, there were 20 of us in our senior class of about 300 people. There were 20 of us that were three sport letter winners. My senior year, we had great athletes. We went to the state tournament in hockey, which we won, football and baseball, and that just doesn't happen anymore. And so. But it was the encouragement of my brother Tom that really pushed us, and by doing that, it gave us a chance to learn to play these different sports and fall in love with these different sports. And so, I to this day, I love all this. I love all the sports. I think it's and I said this earlier, Tom. I think it's a mistake for some of these for some of these players and some of these coaches to not allow these kids to grow up, and I think become better athletes by playing these different sports. And you get a mental break from playing one. There's too many that get burnt out. And I just don't think that there's enough, just enough distance to allow these kids to kind of grow on their own and play some different sports. But that's how I grew up. And it was because of my brother Tom and my older brothers that we just grew with all these other sports.
And folks, Joe Micheletti was a pretty darn good hockey player, if you didn't know that already. Member of the 74 and 76 Minnesota Golden Gophers national championship teams, MVP of the 76 Frozen Four. Did they call it that then? Did they call it the Frozen Four?
No, they did. Final Four, I think it was.
Final Four, yeah. But
Yeah. I've aged a little bit, Tom, since you and I met.
yeah, so yeah, me too. So, but talk about that experience a little bit. Herb Brooks is your coach, of course, famous coach from Miracle on Ice days and so forth. You ought to have a Herb Brooks story or two, I would imagine.
I have a lot of them. You know, he when he was recruiting me, I played forward all my life. I was a centerman,
Hmm.
and just played a little bit of defense here and there, off and on. But I was a forward, and we had just come off winning the state high school hockey championship in Minnesota, which to compare that to something else, it might be like winning, you know, the high school basketball championship in Indiana or something. It was so elite and so difficult to do, and it was such a prestigious thing to do. And there were only 8 schools, and back then it didn't matter if you were a small school, big school, or somewhere in between. They took what were, you know, the 8 regions in Minnesota, and the region winner went to the state high school hockey tournament. So there were 8 teams that went down there, and we ended up winning the state championship, and it was one of the biggest thrills of my life. And then Herb made a visit to me to recruit me to go to Minnesota, and so he makes the drive up to Hibbing and knocks on our door. We'd already prearranged this, and so I answered the door. I met him for the first time. My mother and father, were introduced to him, and he said to me, he said, Joe, I want to talk to your mom and dad for a while. So is there a place you could go to? You could leave. And I said, sure. So I went in the kitchen. He sat with my mother and father for an hour. At the end of it, he says goodbye. He said, Joe, it was nice meeting you. He said, we'll be in touch, and leaves. That was it. And what he did, at that time, in that hour that he spent with my mother and father, he became like our 10th son. I didn't know it, but my mother and father had a love affair with Herb because they believed in who he was. And they believed that he was going to look after their son. And it remained until my parents' deaths, and his untimely death was a real tragedy, because he not only became like a son to my mother and father, but he became a brother to my sisters and my other brothers. Wow. And so that's how close we were as a family. So that's the personal side of it. The hockey side of it is the smartest coach I've ever played for. I learned more about hockey from him than from anyone. When he recruited me, and he told me up front, he said, I'm going to turn you into a defenseman. And I said, really? And because I had just come off of having,
a darn good high school hockey tournament.
The high school hockey tournament, was the best high school hockey, best hockey I had played in my life. And I think I scored 7 goals in 3 games and had 11 or 12 points or something. And so now he's telling me he's going to change me from forward to defense. And I just said, why? And of course, as we all found out later on, and the way Herbie could read people and the way he could sell people and get people to believe, he said, I always play my best athletes on defense. And so, he had me there. It was over. And but he had called me, and he just, he called me, and my father was telling me, he said, make sure you go, because I was being heavily recruited. And he said, make sure you go to these other places, and go to Michigan's, and go to Colorado and Denver and North Dakota, and visit these places and listen to what they have to say. And I said, okay, I'll do that. So about a week later, I'm home by myself. My mother and father were out. Phone rings. I pick up the phone. It's Herbie. And he said, have you been thinking about, much about what we're talking about? And I said, I have, yes. And he said, well, where are you? I said, well, I'm still going to go visit, these other schools. And he said to me, he said, listen, I don't mean to put any pressure on you. He said, but I got a lot of really good blue chip athletes that are dying to come to Minnesota to play. And I don't want to leave them hanging either, So I said, okay, Herb, I'll come. And that was the end of it. I didn't visit any of the other schools, but that was kind of his way. And of course, I never regretted that at all. So it was a fabulous 4 years under him.
Wasn't exactly a hard sell, was it?
No.
So that Miracle on Ice thing, the 80 gold medal for the United States team, that must have carried a little extra meaning for you then.
Oh, it did. Yeah, for sure. And I had, and you remember this because it was at that time, the Olympics were about athletes that were, non-professional.
Right.
If you all the Russians and some of the Czech, that were in the army, those guys were all getting paid. Mm-hmm. But in the U.S. and Canada, it was strictly amateurs, and no one that had signed a professional hockey contract could play in the Olympics. And so a lot of those players that played on that team, I was teammates with. Now, Buzz Schneider still remains a good friend to this day. I think he played in 4 Olympics or so. But Robbie McClanahan and Christoph and Billy Baker and Phil Vercoda, Strobel. So a lot of those players were freshmen, when I was a senior. Mm-hmm. And I was a senior captain this year, so I knew those kids well, and sort of to be able to see them get to that point. And I turned pro. In fact, I was playing in St. Louis, and but I had blown out my knee that year in February, and so I'd had major knee surgery, and I was at home in this huge cast, and those games weren't live at the time, but the first thought I had when they did what they did was I said to myself, there's only one person that could have done this and gotten it done, and that was Herbie. It's only one person, because he had this uncanny ability to read people and to use people and to build a group through not only their talent, and the talent wasn't the most important thing to him, but it was trying to understand who they were. And as people found out later on, the way he would use players against each other, but in a meaningful way, and use players against him to build a team and have them come together, and the way he maneuvered that team to do what they did, I just sat back and I just went, that's Herbie. That's Herbie.
So was the movie, in your opinion, a pretty good depiction of him?
So I've never seen the movie.
What?
I've never seen the movie. I will tell you this, that I have promised recently to watch it with my granddaughter, Kate, who is she just turned 11. She's a heck of a hockey player. She's a twin, and she's watched it 4, 5, 6 times. And she asked me if I would sometime watch it with her, and I said I would. I just, it was, we had such a, relationship, and, personally and family wise, that I've just haven't been able to do it, so, but I remember the year he died, that season, the NHL All-Star game was in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And I worked that game. And at that game, they honored the 1980 team, and they honored, obviously, Herb. who had passed away that's previous summer. And so I saw, that the entire team was there, and I met Kurt Russell. And so this was like 2 hours before the game, and I'm sitting downstairs in one of the in a locker room with Kurt Russell, and we're talking about his role. We're talking about Herbie. We're talking about, I asked him how it was to work with Herb, to prepare for the movie, and he just was so glowing about Herb and the time he gave him and how he helped him with that role. And then I was speaking to Buzzy Schneider, and who's Buzzy's actually his son was one of the stars of the movie. Actually, he played in the movie. Uh-huh. And so, but I asked Buzz. I said, what'd you think of the movie? I said, I haven't seen it. Don't know when I'm going to watch it, and he said it was really, well done. He was happy with it. And so if he was one of the participants in the team and then was happy with the movie, I would say that it was well done.
I've seen it several times, and Kurt Russell's speech, obviously portraying Herb before the Soviet game. I mean, you just want to run through a wall if you can, for the guy. And those guys, I'm sure felt the same way. But anyway, let's move on and talk about Joe Micheletti a little bit more.
I like the other stories better.
You're drafted by the Canadians in '74, but you decide to go to the WHA. What was that decision process like?
Well, we have to revert to Herb Brooks just for a second.
Oh, okay.
Because that 74 draft, I had just completed my freshman year at Minnesota, mm-hmm. and it took me about half a season to learn how to skate backwards to a point where Herb could trust to play me, and he would work with me on skating backwards after every practice, turning both ways and learning the position. So I didn't start playing until about halfway through. In fact, I'll tell you when it was. My first college game was at the St. Louis Christmas tournament. They used to have it every year. St. Louis University was the host. Yeah. And they'd have 4 teams play there every season, every Christmas. And I played my first college game for the University of Minnesota in the Christmas tournament at the old St. Louis Arena. So I don't know. It's kind of crazy when you think about the whole thing. And so anyway, so now we get through the year. We end up winning the national championship at Boston Garden, and I got drafted in the 5th round or 6th round or 7th round by Montreal, and I didn't know it. They didn't televise things, and it wasn't certainly there wasn't social media at that time. So I get a call from Herb's secretary that June, and she said, "Can you come in and see Herb needs to talk to you?" And I said, "Sure." So I go to Herb's office. And I walk in, and he says to me, he says, I just want to let you know, he says, Montreal drafted you in the whatever round it was. But he said, I don't want you to get a big head, and you shouldn't, because he said, don't worry, you'll never play professional. So I just want to let you know. So that was the conversation. It lasted about 30 seconds. And I said, okay, and I left. And again, that's, you think of Herb and you think of his success, and you think, okay, I kind of get it now. That little bit of motivation to, I'll prove that guy wrong, but that was Herb. And so that's how I found out. And so then I played 3 more years there. And if you remember in the NHL during that time, Montreal was in the midst of winning 4 consecutive Stanley Cups. I think it was 74, 75, 76, 77, if I'm not mistaken. And the group of defense that they had on that group were Guy Lapointe, Larry Robinson, Serge Savard, all these Hall of Famers.
Right.
And I was drafted in the World Hockey Association. And so, Montreal offered me a contract. And it was a two-way contract, which meant that if I played in the minor leagues, I would make a lot less money than I would if I would play for the big team.
Right.
And in the Calgary Cowboys and the World Hockey Association offered me a one-way contract with a signing bonus. And, it was an opportunity to play. I knew if I went to Montreal, there was no chance I was going to make that roster. There was no chance. And so I went to the WHA instead, looking, the money was, a little bit better, nothing the way it is now, but it was a little bit more money, and it was an opportunity to get in and play. And Bobby Hull had, there were more and more NHL players that were having contractual issues with the NHL that were leaving to go play in the WHA. So I think it was a very underrated league, and I was able to go to Calgary, play the rest of that 77 season, which was about 22 games. Then they folded. And then I went to Edmonton for 2 years and played for Glenn Sather in Edmonton, and played with Wayne Gretzky and with some great players. And it was a really good break for me, because it gave me the opportunity to play at that level and see if I could compete at that level. So that was the reason for that.
So then how did you wind up in St. Louis in the 79-80 season? How did that transformation take place?
Well, my oldest brother, Tom, who was an attorney, was my agent. And we were having some trouble coming to an agreement with Glenn Sather. Was not only the coach, but he was also the general manager. Yeah. And when it got to an impasse, he just said, so he traded me to St. Louis with another player, Ristos Siltanen was the name. And so that's how I got to St. Louis through a trade from Edmonton. And that was that was the year that it was the merger between the WHA and the NHL. And so there was a lot of things going on, a lot of teams trying to get rights to players. They had to secure, even though Wayne, joined us when he was 17 years old, he wasn't old enough yet to be drafted into the NHL. So the NHL was really making a stink about, wait a second, we want Wayne in the draft this coming year. Yeah. And, our NHL team should have a shot at getting him. And, part of the deal was, no. They had signed him to a 20-year contract back then. And, but that was a real serious negotiation about all that. And Montreal had my rights. So there was all kinds of things. There was so many teams and so much conversation and negotiation going on as to, who assumed the rights of certain players had they been drafted in both leagues. And so anyway, we couldn't come to a contract, and that's how I ended up in St. Louis.
Okay. Well, you're here too, and St. Louis was pretty darn good at that time with, Federico, Sutter, Babbage lighting things up pretty well back in those days. I looked at the 80-81 team, and they had 10 guys who had 20 goals or more. Yeah. Babbage, Federico, Sutter, Blake Dunlop, Jorgen Pedersen, Mike Zook, Perry Turnbull, Tony Curry, Blair Chapman, and Larry Patey. That was a fun team to be on back in those days.
It was. We had such a good team, and so many, not just great players, but really good people. We were really tight. Perry Turnbull, he was just maybe in his second year then, I think. I believe his second year. I don't think it was his first year when he scored the 20 goals. But and Larry Patey was, if you want to call him now a depth player, he was a third and fourth line checking center, penalty killer, one of the best in the league, and tough and gritty. And we just had so much balance. And then of course we had arguably at the time the best goaltender in the league. That year that Mike Liut had, and we were living together at the time, me and Mike and Perry Turnbull, which was too many stories to tell there, not enough time. But, Mike had the kind of season that I think he finished second in the NHL in the MVP voting that year, if I remember correctly. So, to win, you got to have great goaltending, balance, scoring, toughness, depth, all those things. And we had that. And we just didn't play as well in the playoffs as we needed to. That first series was against Pittsburgh. We ended up second in the league that year, and it was, the 16 teams that made the playoffs. The playoff format back then was the number 1 team would play the number 16 seed, number 2 would play 15, and we finished second, and so we played Pittsburgh, who finished 15th in the league, and we had to beat them in double overtime in the clinching game of the series in St. Louis. It was best of 5 at that time. So, it was hard getting through them. And then the Rangers ended up knocking off. Rangers, I think, finished 14th, and they knocked off the number 3 seed, which was LA. And so now the Rangers had just gotten healthy, and they're coming off a huge, series win against LA, and we lost in 6. And, of all the scoring, Bernie's line always seemed to score, with Bernie and Brian Sutter on one side, and then Tony Curry over there. Blair Chapman was another one that played a lot on the right side on that line. And the second line, which was so dominant during the season, with Blake Dunlop at center, Jorgen Pedersen on left wing, and Wayne Babbage on the right side. Wayne was hurt. He had a bad shoulder. He scored 54 goals that season. And so he was all banged up. And Jorgen, who came over from Sweden, it was his first real year of playoff hockey. And so, they really focused on him to try and shut him down. And Blake was such a crafty center iceman and just a really good player. And so so they didn't score at the same level they did in the regular season. And so we just weren't quite there. We had some players injured. Perry was hurt as well. And so Perry Turnbull, and he provided us with so much, toughness and scoring and skating and all kinds of things. And so, you hate to make excuses, but those were some of the facts of what was going on. And we just didn't play as well as we needed to play with the players that were healthy enough to do it. And so it was really disappointing. And, even to this day, it left a bad taste in all of our mouths. But that was a good team. It was a really good team with a great bunch of individuals. And Red Berenson, was our head coach, and he was just terrific, and got fired the next year, which I don't think should have happened. But anyway, that's the way things are. So
yeah. I've had both Red and Mike Liud on the podcast earlier this year, and they both look back on that season and pretty much tell the same story you did, and what if, what could have been, is kind of going around in their minds. Well, let's skirt along here a little bit. Joe Micheletti finishes his career up after a few years here in St. Louis with the Colorado Rockies, which would eventually become the New Jersey Devils. That's in the 81-82 area there. And then you finish up in Austria. Am I right about that?
That's right. Yeah, I went to Vienna, Austria, and played a season there, and which was it was great fun. It was a really good experience. And there were 2 teams in Vienna, and as it turns out, a very good friend of mine and a former teammate in Edmonton, Brett Callaghan, ended up going there as well. So we didn't have kids at the time, and Brett and Ann did not have kids, and so we had a really interesting year. The language was difficult. My wife absolutely loved it. I was always one to come on, let's get on, but you had to try and embrace a slower pace to life, which I had trouble doing. But it was when I look back, it was a great season. Back then most of the players were local players that had full-time jobs. And so we didn't practice until the evenings. And so I went to school. I went to Webster University, which is actually based in St. Louis. Webster University had a wing in Vienna. So I enrolled there and went to school during the day and practiced at night and played 2 or 3 games a week. And my wife Kathy just got to love it, because over there in Vienna at the time, there weren't the big Dierbergs or Schnucks, or you went to one little mom and pop stand to get your grocery, to get your poultry. You went to another one to get your meat. You went to another one to get your vegetables. And so my wife, she became good friends with all these people, and it was a wonderful experience for her. And I wish I would have had a little bit more patience and really appreciated it at the time as much as I do now looking back.
Folks, we had such a great conversation with Joe Micheletti, and he really got on a roll with stories that we're going to have a part 2 with Joe coming up on our next episode. He talks about his playing and coaching days with the Blues, his partnership with Dan Kelly and Dan's tough love to get his broadcast career going, working with Ken Wilson, and eventually his days as a fixture in New York with Sam Rosen and the Rangers. Lots more fun, lots more great stories with Joe Micheletti on part 2. Stay tuned for updates on the release. Thanks for being with me for another episode of the St. Louis Blues Hockey Legends Podcast. We'll have another legend coming up soon, so stay tuned to our social media for news on who that legend might be. Visit PAGuyTom.com or BluesHockeyLegends.com and sign up for our Legends email notifications. The Legends Podcast is also available on the Scoops Sports Network at scoopswithdannymac.com. Video of the podcast is published the Monday after the Friday release of the audio. As always, please like and share on Facebook, X, and Instagram, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It all keeps the Legends Podcast alive and well. Tom Calhoun here saying thanks for being a fan, and let's go Blues!